Hello, everyone. Welcome and thanks very much for joining us. My name is Jennifer Withrow, and I'm the head of exhibitions and publications at the McMichael. We're delighted to have you join us on our now annual Zoom talk, Best of Fair, with our executive director, Ian Dejardin, and our chief curator, Sarah Milroy. We shall begin with a land acknowledgement. Ian, would you do the honors?
Happy to do so. I'm not at the McMichael, but Sarah is, so I think I can go ahead. The McMichael Canadian Art Collection is located on the original lands of the Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, and Huron-Wendat First Nations people. It is uniquely situated along the Carrying Place Trail, which historically provided an integral connection for Indigenous people between Ontario's lakeshore and the Lake Simcoe Georgian Bay region. And as an institution, the McMichael recognizes the importance of acknowledging the original territories of the Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, and Huron-Wendat First Nations people and other Indigenous nations. Over to you.
Thank you. Well, I'll just say a few quick things before we begin. Maybe you're joining us because you've already been to the art fair last night or today. Maybe you're planning to go over the weekend, or maybe you haven't been able to make it to Toronto this year. All three scenarios lend themselves perfectly to this program, which gives a little window into the minds and recent experience of Ian and Sarah, who ran around the fair yesterday for hours. Mostly separately, I think, but sometimes together, to gather up their impressions of, what they loved and what they found important and meaningful and memorable. So we put together a slideshow over the course of the afternoon to give you their fresh takes. And before we dive in, I just want to say this talk is being recorded, so it will land on our YouTube page at some point in the coming days. But if right now you're thinking of someone who really should be on with us, do send them a text or send them the link to join us. And it's our pleasure to beam out high quality Canadian art content all across the country. And we do this with the support of those who have joined our kind of family of Canadian art lovers. There's so many great ways to support us. One of them is to visit us. We are open 6 days a week, Tuesday to Sunday, and holiday Mondays. You can go to our website and click the button join to become a member of the McMichael. Members get all kinds of extra access to advance notice of things going on and extra access to programs. So I hope you might consider joining our family of supporters. With that, I will hand over the floor to Ian and Sarah.
Thanks so much,
I should
Jen.
say we started our tour yesterday together, Sarah, but I lost you very quickly.
I know I have a bad habit of speeding ahead.
Yeah. Also, you know so many people, and so do I. Yeah. It's quite difficult. Anyway, go ahead.
It's actually very hard to attend. It's funny because it's the most sociable type of experience in art fair, but I always find it slightly anxiety producing because you're always seeing 5 people in the same sweep of an eye in a room, and then there's like, oh my God, who am I hugging and saying hello to first? So anyway, it was like right back to the old before times last night with so many great people getting together. And I'm just very struck by this massive work by Rita Letendre, who sadly left us last year, and of course a very important kind of breakthrough artist in the Indigenous cultural scene when she emerged just a half step after the automatiste movement in Quebec. An Indigenous woman painting into that space with a furious intensity. And this diptych, which Simone Blais is offering at the fair, is used to hang in her bedroom, I'm told, by Simone. And it is, really typical of. We had a wonderful exhibition of Rita Letendre a couple of years, I guess it was 4 years ago now, when I first came to the McMichael, where we had a whole room of these really thickly painted, stormy, sensuous pictures. And it was just marvelous to come around the corner and see this great firestorm of a painting. And I'm looking out the window right now. I'm up at the McMichael today, and I'm seeing the light coming through onto the leaves outside. And these are colors to be found in the natural world. And I always feel like Rita is always kind of like calling down the elements in these pictures. We have a couple of close-ups.
Yeah, I was just going to say it relates in color to a painting we'll be looking at a little later, I think, as well, particularly the painterly brushstrokes. I particularly like this period of her work. I'm less fond of the later work, although it's very distinguished, but I expressionist like this, and this kind of explosion in the middle. She must have had a very big bedroom, Sarah.
I think she did, but I think that she lived in an incredible apartment overlooking Moss Park, and she designed a lot of her own furniture. So I was able to go visit her actually with Francois Sullivan when we had Francois Sullivan show at the same time as we had Rita's show. So the two grand dames of Quebec painting. And they hadn't seen each other for many years, and they had a good laugh together, remembering, being at art school together and chain smoking on the front stairs of the École in Montreal and being disapproved of. But I think that they both ended up being renegades for a whole lifetime, and it was just great to feel her presence sort of at the heart of the fair. I think I'm right in saying this is the biggest work being offered at the fair, physically. And the next slide, Jen, is one of the smallest works being offered at the fair, which is this marvelously grotesque little photograph about this big by the French surrealist artist Dora Maar. And I included it here just because the wonderful Cecilia Alemani has been with us at the fair. And Cecilia was the curator of the brilliant Venice Biennial, which is about to close in about a month's time, which brought together an extraordinary array of women artists from all around the world, very strongly representing, I think 90% of the exhibitors were female, with a very strong representation of the global South. And it was a kind of a eruption of a sort. And one of the strong roots in the show is her interest in surrealism. And so I'm putting this here just to kind of signal that Cecilia is in the house. And of course, what Dora Maar is doing is taking a picture of the face, and then she puts eyelashes on the nostrils and turns it into this truly horrific creature with the lipstick and the curly hair. And I think this is probably the kind of thing that Ian hates the most. but I don't know.
Quite that way. I think I'm certainly intrigued.
Word. Yeah,
I'm
it was
intrigued.
incredible around the corner and see this.
Well, surrealism is such an important thing, it's an important moment. You either get it or you don't. And I kind of feel like I worry about and this is the old fogey in me, which is going to be revealed very strongly throughout this slideshow, I might add. But my reaction to this is that it's kind of like a punchline. It's there's a joke in there, and I laugh and I enjoy it. But beyond that, I have to confess I'm not wild about it. There you go.
Well, I can't begin to express my love for Dora Maar, but I understand what you're saying. There's a comic impulse in surrealism that is very strong, and this element of the grotesque. And so I just put one more slide after this one, which is the wonderful Manuel Mathieu from Montreal, who audiences in Toronto will know. He had a brilliant show here at the Power Plant, organized by Gaëtan Vernat, that brought a whole selection of his often mega-sized paintings, and they all share this kind of ambiguity. In a way, it reminds me of Dora Maar, because there's this element of grotesquerie, and also this is called The Awakening, and it has this kind of lumbering feeling about it, this walking form, whatever it is. But then these swirls of paint and pigment that are kind of nightmarish, and it's really unclear what it is we're looking at, but it definitely has a creaturely kind of quality to it. So Manuel's show is now touring internationally. He is only 36 years of age, but he's one of Canada's rising stars. And so I thought we would make him roommates with Dora Maar for the afternoon. Do you want to take us to the next slide now for something completely different?
Here we go.
Yes.
Now this is the old fogey in me coming out big and strong here. And I have a funny feeling last year, Sarah, when we did this, I'm absolutely certain I chose another Nicholas Turner.
Well, they're beautiful.
Well, I think they are beautiful. I'm Jonathan Cooper. I was talking to Jonathan yesterday, and we were both laughing at each other's accents. Basically, we sound the poshest people at the fair. And anyway, there were some very nice things by Nicholas. I chose this one simply because it's not really, it's very recent. It's this year. And I'm
Mm.
more aware of him working, and there were examples of this at the booth, at Jonathan's booth,
Mhm.
where he's working really in the style of Alfred Wallace. You know, it's very consciously St. Ives oriented art, and there was a piece that looked very much like a slightly more tidied up Alfred Wallace, and I like those things too. But I'm very interested in this because it reminds me, if anything, of another St. Ives artist, perhaps Christopher Wood, um,
Yes.
something like that. Now, the thing is, this is kind of England, peaceful and serene, green, pleasant land, blah, 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 horse riding, all of those things that brought us to Brexit, sadly. So in a way, I shouldn't
Mm.
perhaps like it as much as I do, because I think, you know, British people's nostalgia for a green and pleasant land is hasn't done us much good lately.
Turned
But
out to
in
be quite
art,
destructive.
I know, in art, I think I can just about forgive it. And I think this is really so lovely. I think it's a beautiful little painting. So I make no apology. And I don't blame Nicholas Turner for Brexit. I'm sure he had nothing to do with it. There you go. Now, this is another one I chose. And it hasn't, I have to say, the reproduction doesn't do it any favors, but it gives you some kind of sense. You know, if you're looking at this and all you see is it looks as if we've missed out a slide, look
Yeah.
carefully again, because the more you look at it, you'll suddenly see some orange and red kind of glowing out of the bottom half of this image. Jim Verberg works in, he's now based in Toronto, but comes from Montreal. And he works with layers. So you have these layers of tarlatan, very kind of like fine scrim-like fabric. And
Mm.
he uses paints on, or color on, all different layers, and then layers them up together. And what you get is, it's like seeing a Joseph Albers, but, you know, after 3 gin and tonics. It's kind of, it kind of glows out at you, and you
Yeah, they're
can't quite
very
be sure
beautiful.
what you're looking at. But it's intensely beautiful and very meditative, I find.
Very much so.
I stare at a Jim Verberg for ages. I think they're very beautiful. And yeah, he's moving on, 7 layers of color. So yes, Erin Jones. This is also actually a Zaluki, Juliana Zaluki.
Mhm.
She's got a really good booth this year. She's local to me here. You know, she has her gallery up in the Junction. And this is Erin Jones. And Erin Jones is based in Toronto, Black artist. And the only reason I mention that is because you suddenly find a significance in the title here, Strange Fruit, which of course refers to Billie Holiday's great song, horrific song, about lynching in the Deep South. And it's a collage, and I like collage. I've always liked collage. I did a show 100 years ago at Dulwich Picture Gallery of John Piper's collages, you know, early, before he became a kind of national trust icon, you know, painting these lovely images of, um, stately homes, that kind of thing. And he was John Piper was a very good collage artist. And so I got into it then. And I like this. And there are several other examples at Juliana's booth. But I particularly chose
Mhm.
this one, partly
Collage
because of the
is
title,
There's a
but
very
also the colors.
electrifying. There's a very
Yeah.
electrifying one of a snail. I was in looking at this because I see you'd selected it, but I'd somehow missed it last night. So I went round for a look, and then I phoned Aaron and talked to him about this piece. And he, just because I was curious about the 2 elements of it and what exactly we were looking at on the bottom part of that image. And the top part is apparently a semi-desiccated aloe plant. And the bottom part is a bug. And apparently Aaron, someone in
I
his
knew it
studio,
was a bug.
yeah, it's
Yes.
like the wings of some kind of a bug, and but hugely magnified. And you know, he was talking a little bit about how fascinated he'd been by like back issues of National Geographic, which he'd collected and cut up, and that whole way in which those magazines kind of presented what were, to the editors of National Geographic, exotic parts of the world, and incorporating that. But he also had another person in his studio building who was throwing out this vast trove of blown up nature shots that he then was like, thank you very much, I'll take that. And this was one of the many works that came out of that. But it's really worth checking these out. They're extraordinary. Apparently he has some other works that are on show at University of Toronto Arts Center in the Ken Montague's Wedge Projects show as well right now. So definitely
Really, I'll go and
yeah.
I was very impressed. I mean, the other ones were apart from the snail, there was a kind of landscape
Yes.
element to it, and
Yes.
quite rather more serene. But no, I just looked at that and thought, that's a bug. And lo and behold, I was right. I'm glad about that. I'm also glad I don't have to meet said bug ever, I
Yes.
hope.
For some reason, sometimes it's nice to live in northerly climes.
I know, I don't like bugs. Okay,
Fine.
next.
Next. Moving on.
Well, guess who chose this one? But I bet
We both
you
love
did
it.
as well, Sarah. But anyway, I sort of went for this like a moth to a flame at Masters Gallery. Tom Thompson, of course. I mean, we're working on a Tom Thompson show, Sarah and I, at the moment for next summer. So anyone who's watching this, make a mental note. It will have wonderful things in it. I'm fascinated by this. It's in 1916. It's a particular moment, I think, in his short comic career. And he's looking at the sort of interiors of woods. And so you get this wonderful screen of birch trees, in this case. And the colors are also screaming autumn and fall. So that's nice for this time of year. But the thing is the blue. I'm always fascinated by the way he uses blue. He uses it for distance so that you get that glimpse of a hill behind there in the background. Thank you. Nice cursor work there, Jen. But you also get those, he likes the striping effect that you get with shadows with a low afternoon sun. And that is interesting because it relates, I think, to a very famous seminal piece by A.Y. Jackson from 1910, At the Edge of the Maplewood, which we know there's a record of Lauren Harris and Tom Thompson standing in front of it, discussing it at a 1912 exhibition of the Ontario Society of Arts. And they were riveted by it. And one of the characteristics of that is the very brilliant shadow of the tree falling. And you see that Thompson, in fact, nearly all of them investigate that idea in their art, but Thompson in particular, it seems to enjoy it. And what I like about it is that he enjoys it in a kind of abstract way. It's the patterning that is fascinating. This would have been done in half an hour, something like that, probably, really fast, slapping the paint on. Miraculous, really.
I find, when I look at it too, one of the things that's so typical of his unconventional way of seeing things, because many artists, including Thompson, of course, have painted fall color on the trees. But, he has the insight to paint fall color on the ground after the leaves have all fallen off. And there is that period of time when it's still very, very vivid. But it's actually, the action is not up in the trees anymore. It's a layer on top of the dirt. And, it allows him to create these incredibly dramatic striations of dark and bright color together. But it's a beauty.
It's a beauty. It was a great pleasure to come across it. And then next to it was the next one. Yes. And A.Y. Jackson, I always find him slightly variable, partly because he was so prolific, but also he was very experimental. And sometimes his experiments, I think, were less successful than others. But at this moment, I think he was always happiest tramping through Quebec on his snowshoes and recording that the architecture that he felt was disappearing fast from the Quebec landscape. And so I think, he cornered the market in Quebec snow pieces. And interestingly, of course, that was where the money was. I mean, I think Quebec snow pieces kept him in bread and butter for many a long year. But the fact is, this is just a lovely thing, and I think the colors are really beautiful. And I love the way he's just added that little bit of pink in the
Yeah.
sky, so you get that sense of imminent snowfall. It's beautiful. A
I mean, I
really
think,
lovely little thing.
we don't really think so much of Jackson as, we think of him as an Ontario artist, but of course he was a Quebecer.
He was
And,
indeed.
and really, really understood that landscape and was such an important conduit for ideas about painting between Quebec and English Canada.
Well, yeah,
That,
I always think the interesting thing, one of the most interesting things about Jackson is that 1920 was a banner year for him, and he was a founding member of the Group of Seven, of course, but he was also a founding member of the Beaver Hall Group in Montreal at the same year. And history kind of favored the Ontario side of it, but actually he was putting feet firmly down in both provinces. Anyway, here to Quebec. And I think next up, and you'll laugh at me for this one.
oh, never.
Well, I mean,
That
it's signed.
sky.
It is quite remarkable.
It's amazing.
France, and it's right to call him, he's not Frank at this point, he's France, because he did change his name to France in 1928, I think it was. And so this is probably in all probability long after the Group of Seven. I mean, he left after about 20 minutes in 1920, 21. But in the 30s and 40s, he also, there's a certain element of pot boilerness about Frank Johnston. He was always looking, he needed to earn his daily bread, as do we all, but he took it seriously, and he produced these things that were popular and sold. And very often, because there is that sort of hint of, I call it chocolate box painting, he skates on thin ice sometimes, Frank Johnston. You look at them and think, oh dear, when you think how he started, and then you think, did you really have to turn out so many of these? But then if you look closely and look at the color, it's actually electrifying. And that blue, as you so rightly say, is completely extraordinary. But the reason I put it in was to mentally go back to that Tom Thompson, and also to the painting I mentioned before, the A.Y. Jackson Edge of the Maplewood. Because look, there they are again, these blue shadows of the trees across the foreground. All of them were so riveted by that effect that Jackson had absolutely nailed in that earlier painting. And it recurs again and again and again in all of those who saw it in 1912. And here it is again with Frank Johnston many years later. This is actually one of the nicest I've seen. I think it's a beauty of its kind.
And one could be forgiven for thinking that color was straining veracity, but it's really not. There's a certain time in the winter when the sky is this unearthly blue.
Yeah, and the low sun. Yeah, and the catching the pink on the bark. He was never less than a virtuoso painter, Frank Johnston. So I was glad to see this.
So now we have completely different kind of landscape painting coming next.
Yes, that is rather different.
Trees. I just thought, we have to look at David Urban's 7 outlets, because it's it's party time here and the boombox is going, and it's this incredible effect of obviously vibrant sound and color. And, David is such a fantastic painter, but also, when you look at it as we do at McMichael in the context of Canadian art overall, it is a landscape painting, and it's sort of a landscape 100 years later or more. And so, I felt if we're going to be looking at the Group of Seven, we should definitely show 7 outlets as well. And it reminds me of a work that we have up on the wall right now, Ian, in your conversations show, the rehang of our permanent collection that we just opened, by Sarah Ann Johnson, which is this sort of party going on outside. It's sort of a rave picture, really, in a way. And yeah, how times have changed. But anyway, I felt David needed to be here if we're going to be talking
Yes.
about.
And the other thing to note about it is it's huge.
Yes, it's enormous.
It's a great big thing. And so the sort of sense standing in front of it of being overwhelmed by
Yeah.
noise is really quite extraordinary, I thought.
It really is.
It's such a wham bam piece.
Can I interject and just say I find the bottom section instantly I'm reminded of one of those terrifying maps of dance steps where the feet
Oh,
are,
yeah.
you know, kind of choreographed with these swoops and swirls, and you're like, how could anyone ever follow that? That's
Never
sort of
feel
what I
it.
see in that
Oh,
bottom
that's
section.
funny. Yeah,
Probably rightly. Oh my word.
I know.
Yes, this was such, I don't know, Sarah, you'll no doubt want to talk about this as well, but I'm leaping in just
Please.
because it brought me to a halt.
Mhm.
Patterson Ewan. Now, of course, Patterson Ewan has been one of the great discoveries for me coming to Canada. I was unaware of him before in my benighted state in the UK. And of course, I got to know him through the great big 8 by 12 foot plywood pieces, where he takes a router to a piece of plywood and kind of carves it into these extraordinarily powerful kind of cosmological things. And lo and behold, here he is. I mean, I know he started, he was trained, I think, by Goodrich Roberts of all people,
Mhm.
and started as a landscape painter. And here we are in 1961, and Michael Gibson, whose gallery is showing these, was telling me that at this period he tended to choose a color, and then an entire show would be all in this color. And I mean, wow, yellow monochrome. This was the color I was referring to, that the Rita Latendre was
Mhm.
looking at. You know, it's the
Right out
same.
that
It's come out
window
the
right
same
now.
tube. Yeah,
Exactly.
but what
Yeah.
fascinates me here is those swirls. You know, on the
Mhm.
one hand, he's building up paint in a kind of opposite way to the way that he gouges out the plywood later. He's always interested in this kind of sculptural relief thing, and he's here achieving it through layering on paint and then stirring it round. And the reference clearly is to Van Gogh, I think.
Mhm. Yeah.
Starry, Starry Night.
Well, when you
Uh,
look at Patterson's, when you go to his home and look at his bookcase, the books are all still there as he left them. And many of those books are about, weather events and cosmology and astronomy, and also, of course, about the history of European painting. Van Gogh, Giotto was another really important artist to him. But, what I think is so extraordinary about this piece is that 1961 is this kind of hinge point between we're going to see in a moment a later another work which is more of a clear abstraction, where this really does seem to be starting to turn towards a consideration of the heavens, but it's still an abstraction, and of course in monochrome, so it's like one step away from even further from realism, but it definitely has this ferocious energy and this feeling of of major weather phenomena, or events in the celestial events in the heavens that were to become his lifelong preoccupation. So this is like the little acorn that's just sort of, we can just see it, everything that's coming in this painting. It's
and look at
extraordinary.
it, it's tiny, 10 by 14 inches, and yet the impact, it kind of knocks you off your feet.
It does. And Jen, let's
Yeah,
have a look at the next one too, because it's also, here's just
and
bringing
there's it
you
in
in for it,
detail. Gosh.
so you can smell the paint. But this also beautiful, handsome piece as well, which is also at Michael Gibson's.
Isn't that lovely? And it reminds, I mean, it's literally layering paint on with a trowel.
Mhm.
And it's like kind of plaster work. And I don't know whether he actually, whether it is just dense paint. I suppose it probably is, but it kind of looks like plaster. But it reminds me, Sarah, it's as if someone had said to him, can you do me a Bordeaux but in blue?
Yeah, but it blew. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, it
and
has
the
that
blue, it's
wonderful materiality to it, and a sense of, I always feel like with Bordeaux, you can see how it was made. You
yeah.
can see the sequence of it, and that it becomes almost performative. And I feel like it's residue of a performance, that you could really imagine.
it's such an exquisite color. I mean,
It is.
it's not just blue. It's kind of almost violet. It's sort of Elizabeth Taylor's eyes kind of color.
It
Very
is.
extraordinary. Anyway,
Yes.
beautiful. Oh yeah. And I put this in. I mean, I've just hung Jean McEwen in conversations at McMichael. Our one is red. And he works in this format, the dark line down the middle. And the red one at McMichael is the same, except it's red. But it shares this, and what I liked about this was that you can see around the edges
Mhm.
how complicated the layering of paint is.
It is.
And
Yeah. Exactly.
I understand he started as a kind of self-taught artist, and then, uh, a certain amount of success, and then he hooked up with Riopelle and Sam Francis and people like that in Paris, and then developed his own very unique style. And just the flickering density of the color there, and you can see there's orange under there too, and it
Mhm.
just suddenly peeks through. So they're vibrant. They look almost
They're
enameled.
kind of, yeah, they're kind of fathomless too. I always find myself thinking about Rothko when I look at Jean McEwen.
Yeah.
I mean, the scale is, I mean, one of the things about Quebec abstract painting generally in relation to American is that the scale is so much smaller, usually, except for Riopelle, who, shoots the lights out in terms of scale. But, this moodiness, this sense of being pulled into the dark core of something, is very much there in Jean McEwen as well. They're very beautiful things.
It's a lovely piece. And this was something I came on. I was actually leaving the show, and then Eric, who I was with, turned around and said, "We haven't seen that booth." At which point I was practically on my knees. I mean, exhausted. But I was dragged back, kicking and screaming, to look at these last two booths, and lo and behold, here was this astonishing
Mhm.
Oscar Kahane, who I remember we looked at last year as well, because there were a couple of things last year and they were absolutely outstanding. And since then, I think I've seen Pat Feely had that show,
Mhm.
and Oscar Kahane is coming back into style. And my goodness, such a colorist.
Incredible. And
I think it's beautiful.
there's another Kahane in that I had chosen as well that we put into the slide deck. It's the next slide, Jen. Objet d'art, which is being shown by Masters. It's a great big painting, but for me, it's one of my favorite things in the show this year. I think it's remarkable. And again, it's so funny. I was saying about the other day, this tradition in Toronto of, avant-garde painting that comes out of commercial design studios, because Oscar, like the group of seven who are all commercial designers and illustrators and so on before, with the exception of Harris, Oscar Kahane and many members of the Painters 11 were involved in those design industries. And it's a very different trajectory than Quebec abstraction, where it comes out of like this impulse towards social change and this relationship with surrealism and automatic writing coming from Breton, coming to Montreal. These are paintings that are coming out really out of more formal concerns than a quest for liberation of society, for example. And so it's in a way a less heroic history in Toronto, but the work that was produced in Painters 11, I do think, we said this last year as well, I think, but they are due for a reassessment and representation.
Oh, certainly. I mean,
Sure.
it's the control apart from anything else. I mean,
Yeah.
the color is exquisite. I mean, it shines off the wall, but also that kind of instinctive and absolute control of composition.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't imagine anything different, and yet it's painterly. So, with painterly, the idea of painterly is almost that it's kind of lack of control. The brushes are just going everywhere, but it's absolutely rigidly controlled and couldn't be better. It's a really beautiful piece.
Jen, you can take us deeper into it. I think I put a detail slide in here as well.
Oh, look at that.
Get your nose into the paint again.
That's gorgeous.
Okay. I can't remember what we put next here, but yes.
This is
Move
me.
on, then.
Well, this was a Paul Petro, and at first I kind of walked under it because it hung quite high and didn't really notice it. And then Paul was telling me about it, and it is fascinating. Michel Dumont, he's a queer, two-spirited Métis artist, and he's working in ceramics. I think he's quite early in his career. He'd done a residency in Banff, apparently, with ceramics, but focusing on ceramics. And he likes working kind of mosaic in broken ceramic, based in Thunder Bay now. And this is, it made me laugh in a way, but it's a wonderful piece. It's so beautiful. Banff leather pride bear. So you have this bear clad in kind of fetishistic leather, and covered in badges, like any pride parade you've ever been on. There, you basically wear your badges with pride. But also because the use of the flower motif that's spreading over the bear's ferocious face is obviously an indigenous marker as well.
Yeah.
So it's this coming together of the Métis and queer spirit. I thought was just very joyful and lovely.
It is fantastic.
So that's why I put it in.
Yeah.
His expression is so wonderful.
I know.
It's not scary. It's
No.
just enthusiastic.
When you actually look inside that mouth, the tongue is there and those teeth are ferocious. So yeah, no, it's been beautifully detailed and carefully thought through.
But he just kind of looks like he's smiling. Yeah. So I mean, it's
Yes, exactly. Mind you, if you hung it a bit lower, I think the smile would disappear fairly quickly. But yeah, we're safe as long as it's up that
it is
high.
a wonder. Yeah, Alicia Henry. So people in Toronto will remember, and I think the show is still traveling now. Trying to remember where it is, but Black American artist who, again, it was a power plant show that we were all very, very lucky to see here, and these incredible fabric sculptures, essentially, and with paint on them that are hung on the wall.
I find her fascinating. I mean, I chose her as well, and I think it's very imposing. She uses recycled fabric, just vintage stuff, and turns it into these extraordinary figures that are never ingratiating. And she's investigating bodily images, but these masks, of course, are rather disturbing. They sometimes veer towards Ku Klux Klan in some curious kind of way, so they have a sinister quality to them as well. But very often the detail, I think there is a detail
there are two details, I think.
Wonderful blue dress, if we could, yes, look at that. The stitching on it and the color and the way she's used the fabric. As you know, I'm a great textile art fan, and I love it when I can look at stitching like this and see the way she stained the fabric. I think she's a remarkable artist. She's based in Nashville, if I'm not mistaken. And look at that little figure on the left. The sort of jester hat.
Yeah, I mean the grasp of like pose to be evocative, is, I mean, they're very, very minimal, but so much is achieved with these very ostensibly simple forms. There's an awful lot that's conveyed, and I think that's really where the mastery lies.
Well, she never falls into the trap of cuteness.
No.
And the thing with working with textile like this, cutting up textile, that you could easily do that, and she never does. There's always this edge to them. There's always an undercurrent of unease. I think she's a very, very powerful, wonderful artist. I loved that show at the power plant. Okay. Oh,
or something completely different again.
I know. I have a funny feeling that Molly Land Boback was not in Uninvited, You're a Great Show, Sarah. And I think it's probably because she was a little late.
Yeah.
In date. But she deserves to be in there. And there is a link, incidentally, to Uninvited. If people are watching this, remember that gorgeous show. It's touring the country at the moment. But there was a portrait in there by Vera Weatherby,
Mhm.
the wonderful Vera Weatherby, of Harold Mortimer Lamb. And that was Molly Lamb Bobach's father. And I hadn't realized that.
Yeah.
And then I read further, and it's all horribly scandalous and awful. But because he married Vera Weatherby when, as an much older man,
Mhm.
and Molly was the daughter of his housekeeper, who lived with him and his wife was sickly, and it's a very interesting, fascinating story. Anyway, completely irrelevant to this gorgeous little thing. Look at it, 7 inches by 11. And
Amazing.
Molly Lamb Bobach just loved crowds, and she does crowds. We've got a
Yeah.
wonderful big one at the McMichael, which is a kind of packed holiday beach scene.
Mhm.
And here we've got this July the 1st celebration with, everyone marching through the streets, all on the tiny scale. And it's just so joyful. I absolutely love it.
It reminds me of, Peggy Nicole McLeod's paintings of New York that she made. I mean, Peggy, who's in the Uninvited show, is in Vancouver now, but she was really interested in this idea of cities as places where people come together and celebrate. And she did wonderful paintings of orchestra pits or audiences or people in their victory gardens, or, looking out at street scenes and looking at the patterns of people in windows and cities, but this kind of repetitive motifs that I'm seeing in this Molly Lamb Bobach too, the idea of coming together and the pleasures of cities. And it's a kind of iconography in Canadian art that's often overshadowed for our, interest in nature themes and landscape, at least traditionally in Canadian art. And,
Those
there's
flags. Look at the flags.
made wonderful war art as well. And wonderful art of women in the war effort, Molly Lamb Bobach did.
Yes, she was the first woman to go over from Canada as a war artist, if I remember rightly, in World War II. But whether her interest in parades comes from that, I don't care. I just love the joyous quality of that. I love the cheerleaders. I just it
I always
makes me
love
laugh,
cheerleaders.
and it's so tiny. It's so beautiful. Anyway,
The little jewel.
really
Well, I
lovely.
put
Can't help
another.
but think of the Manet concert in the Tuileries picture as well with that this composition.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose so. Yes, absolutely. And that coverage, I mean, the way she's caught the trees and the sun coming through the trees as well. She's a very, very fine artist, married to Bruno Bobach, of course.
We have one of his up at the gallery right now. So I tucked this in, Ian, just because we're looking very hard at Karalik these days. We're just in the middle of making a book about his series, A Jewish Life in Canada, which we've just been able to bring into the collection at McMichael, 16 paintings on that theme from 1975. And this is made 5 years earlier. And I think what we're looking at here, I mean, it's hard to, of course, it has Karalik's wonderful framing around it, which Ian has written a wonderful essay on for our forthcoming publication. But it seems to me, Ian, that he's looking at a remembered scene of a Ukrainian past that this does not look like, Manitoba to me, with those grass roofs. I think it's, the title is Coming Home. And I think that he made a trip. I meant to look this up today and then didn't, but he made 2 trips to the Ukraine, one which was very much truncated and another one near the end of his life. And it seems to me that this is very much about the old country, and which is, he heard about a lot growing up from his father and mother, tales of, the family life and also of trauma in Ukraine, which had already had several rounds of horrific violence at the hands of Russians or Soviets or Cossacks or whatever terms were used in the various different historical periods. But this is this kind of dreamlike image of the mother and children. It looks to me like awaiting the arrival of the head of the household. The food and dishes are all laid out in front of the house, and the mother has fallen asleep with the children in the front, and what appears to be moonlight. I mean, this picture actually glows. You step back from it and you think, this is very bizarre, because it seems to be emitting blue light. So I mean, Krellick's way of evoking a scene, particularly there's a very famous Krellick painting of rows of cabbages by moonlight, which records a kind of epiphany that he had at night about God's presence, which became a kind of fanatical obsession of his in his life as he moved forward out of his sort of mental illness of his earlier years. But this is just a deeply peaceful, beautiful scene. And I think it, is a kind of record of his fascination with his Ukrainian roots.
It is lovely, and you'll forgive me for ranting on about the frame. The frame is extraordinary again. I mean, they always are. He was a frame maker. He was a professional frame maker before he really took off as a painter. But his frames are unique, and they're so much part of an image because of the choices that have gone into them. And in this case, I think, this carved pattern reminds me of the kind of Ukrainian ribbon design that he uses in one of the paintings up at the McMichael at the moment. So it has a kind of folksy element to it, but the sophistication that I always love is the little hidden areas of color, like the sort of bluish carved frame is sort of set within a tray, and at the side of the tray is stained. It's actually more pink than orange, like it looks here.
Yeah.
And then just look, the edge of the carved piece of wood is also stained orange, and so you get these curious complementary colors that somehow are important. They're intrinsic to the impact of the work of art.
Well,
I struggle to find anyone quite like him in this regard.
They pick up usually on something that's in the image. So I bet you if you went hunting for that scarlet that we're seeing inside the gold there,
yeah,
you can find it in a little bowl or something. There'd be something in that scene that he's just amplifying, giving a little pop to by doing that. But anyway, it's just a beautiful little work, and some lucky person hopefully is going to find it a good home.
Is there a connection, you think, to the nativity? We have the moonlight on the
I was wondering that with the star. I mean, I'm sure
the
that
star.
The positioning of that star is so deliberately bang on center over the cradle.
And also, Krellick was always often, sort of laying in a little leitmotif of some Christian iconography in many of his works. Like you'd often seen like a city scene, but with like Mary and Joseph and the donkeys at City Hall or something like that. Like he often would just kind of subtly, give you a little note that said, this is the context within which you can think about this image. So I think you're right.
Interestingly, I mean, we need to move on, but interestingly, that idea comes from earlier Flemish old master paintings. I mean, that the idea of embedding a religious scene within a landscape, and he was well aware of those. So it is deliberate as well.
Yeah.
Fascinating artist. And another one. Wow.
I know. Well, these are a pair of beautiful Rajni Pereiras. Rajni, Sri Lankan-born Canadian artist in her kind of early mid-career, I guess we could say. I think would no longer be called an emerging artist, but she's certainly one of our most beloved. And we're going to be opening a show with Rajni in the middle of November. And I will confess, Jen, that I may give our registrars a heart attack by wanting to pull these two beautiful works into our show, because we are going to be presenting a new triptych that she's just made, which is going to be coming in, I think, to the McMichael about 3 days before the show opens. It's going to be a bit of a hairpin turn, but these are wonderful brand new works as well, and they're both already sold, but to wonderful, generous people who are happy to share. So just you'll see the figure on the right hand side. In true Rajni fashion, has multiple eyes. So Rajni is often, giving us these kind of mutated human forms that are adapting to future worlds. And the work is rife with diasporic themes, with feminist themes, with environmental themes, but just this absolutely exquisite attention to detail and craftsmanship in the way that she builds the image, and an absolutely unique sense of color as well in her work. And so I would be remiss not to celebrate Rajni's two beautiful works here. And another colorist here, Ian, we snuck this in on you.
Thank you.
The
Well, I
Perehuda.
mean, I'm pleased. I mean, I didn't really notice it properly and went back and saw it. And I'm often, I, I don't know how you feel about this, but I feel Perehuda kind of flies under the radar a bit, and he's often, you see an awful lot of Jack Bush, less actually this time at Art
Yes,
Toronto.
that's true.
And he is, he's often compared to him, and you kind of feel that Jack Bush gets the limelight. But I've always, frankly, and no apologies to Sarah Stanners, who's your predecessor, who was a great Jack Bush scholar, but I've always secretly, guiltily preferred Perehuda. And I particularly love this one. The colors aren't great in this slide, I would say. I think that kind of the large sheet of yellowish color on the left is more. There's a bit more kind of brass to it. It's a metallic kind of color, and you're far more aware of that sudden glimpse on the very left-hand side of the bright yellow. It does register very much as something behind.
Yes, it does.
And so you get this feeling of a kind of light-filled space behind these two abstract sheets of color, but no, very beautiful.
I wish whoever would buy it, I mean, we're saying this here officially, would turn around to give it to us at the McMichael, because I'm thinking here, Ian, of the fantastic Tactinabe that we took in from the collection of Chris Brett and Jamie Cameron last year, which has similar prairie palette of colors. And it is just barely a landscape, you can see, but it's these large passages of exquisitely coordinated pigments that suggest landscape more than actually represent it. And I really feel like these are meant to be together forever. So we'll have to get busy on that, because this is a really great Perehuda.
Absolutely. And after that shameless plea, let's move on.
Well, what are you going to do, you know?
This is this was hidden in a little corner of MKG 127, a gallery, and it was such a pleasure stumbling on these. And actually, I would have liked to have shown more of Micah Adams's work. Like Bill Burns, he works on a tiny scale. As a jeweler, I mean, spent time at the Toronto Harbourfront doing in the jewelry studio, the metal jewelry studio there. Young artist from originally hailing from Nova Scotia, but that the middle photo there is what you actually see, and you think, have they taken something down? You know, it's basically nails hammered into the wall, and then when you get up close, each nail head is one of these extraordinary, beautifully detailed portrait heads. I thought it was one of the great surprises of the show, and I was deeply impressed. But in the case below it, there's some lovely things as well. Some of them with that kind of sense of humor. You know, there were sort of little tins, food tins, that he's put a little ladder on so that it's like a tiny swimming pool. Dive in with the tuna. But no, I was deep. I just thought they were utterly charming, but such level of skill too.
Because I was just galloping around at such a pace, I did manage to miss these. So now I'm going to be going back tomorrow and hunting them down.
It's lovely,
fantastic.
And it's Bill Burns, isn't it? Yes. On the opposite wall, and you'll love that, Sarah. So don't miss it. It's a lovely little alcove.
It'll be on my flight path tomorrow. And this wonderful thing, oh my goodness. What
an astonishing display this was. The whole of the booth, the Marion Scott Gallery, I congratulate them. It was one of the high points of the show, not just because of this amazing Shubinai, and what that woman is up to now. I mean, she's just exploding creatively. She's all over the place. It's extraordinary. But everything on the walls and the little sculptures on the side, they were all beautifully displayed as well. And I thought this was a high point of the show.
Yeah, me too. There's another one too, Jen. And then I went back today and took a couple of more details of this so people can just see. And of course they all, yeah, and then there's this, and then on the other side of it, I think I took another picture. But of course they're these very, these extraordinary images of animals that are morphing and changing in a way. We were looking at Rajni Pereira a minute ago, but in this idea of, transformation and sometimes a kind of a nightmarish sense of a sort of future world. That's something that you get in Chauvenay as well. And of course, she's a Cape Dorset artist and has recently been shown in the Venice Biennale we were just talking about earlier. She's in that exhibition up until the end of November and has represented Canada in many international events now. Liverpool Triennial is another recent one. And of course, we love her work and see her as the kind of, she's really one of the leading figures in Cape Dorset now, working as many artists are in often a very large scale, but this moving drawing into the dimension of sculpture. Now, of course, they're all made out of paper, so they move as well. So it becomes this kind of galaxy of imaginary, views, and it's just not to be missed.
Apparently, these were done in Vancouver in collaboration with one of the printmaker was helping her, and the shapes. Because I was asking how were the shapes? Did she work directly onto the finished shapes? But no, I mean the paper was in the correct shape to form these elaborate hanging shapes, and then she drew on them flat on the floor, and then they're put round a kind of a skeleton structure of a lightweight structure. So they're lightweight but very they're sturdy.
Sturdy, yeah.
And the other thing to bear in mind is that they all spin.
Yeah.
So when we've got frozen pictures here, but actually that thing is moving slowly round in a circle, and so the faces that peer up through the mirror on the floor just change. It's a magical thing.
It really is
Beautiful.
Anyway, bravo to Chauvenay. And another a younger artist, Lucy Sela, was just born in 1991, so she's really, one of the emerging generation up there in Cape Dorset. So continuing this rather fantastical tradition that seems to be coming out of that community. And, she's the granddaughter of Pauda Sela, and I hadn't realized that, whose wonderful bear, large kind of cube-shaped bear sculpture is right outside our front door at the McMichael. And, she is drawn to, I think Pat Feely's gallery has shown her work quite recently, and a lot of the works dealt with environmental themes. This is a rather improbable Arctic landscape, given that it has roses and all sorts of other wonderful flowers growing in it. But she's, simply explaining to Pat that she's interested in color, and, she's obviously been traveling in the South, coming down for her shows down here, and really delighting in those new experiences that she's having in the South. But, Kanojuak, who's like one of the great founding godmothers of Inuit art, is, known for the enchanted owl. But I think, the owl mistress of owls runner-up prize has to go to Lucy Sela, who's made, a number of fantastic drawings of owls, and many of which have been, several of which have been made into prints. But they are every bit as arresting, I think, as Kanojuak's, if not a bit more sort of trippy and out there. And this is a perfect example of this little creature on the right-hand side here that we see looking at us. And she, often the owl form is kind of distorted and extended in interesting ways with color applied to it. But, they are images that don't easily leave your mind. Like so many of the great things we've looked at today. But anyway, a little moment for Lucy. And this was a piece that Ian and I came across, Jobina Pedataquat, who Resilient Repugnance here, Baptism Gowns. I hadn't been aware of this artist's work, but apparently she's just recently had a show at Ottawa Art Gallery. I think it's no longer up, but she's 40 years old now. My understanding is she's completing a degree at Concordia, a master's degree. So she's still in this kind of stage in her life where she's emerging. But these are, baptismal gowns that she has sourced. She has beaded them, and you can show us, Jen, some of the other detail shots of this, but beaded them with these motifs. Her people are Kitigan Zibi Anishinabeg is her home community, Algonquin. And so she's introducing that iconography very delicately and beautifully and very humbly, really. There's no, it's just it feels like a very heartfelt gesture, exploring this relationship between her indigenous heritage and also the Christian faith that has been, part of her family story as well. So we are very lucky. I think we can say, Ian, that we have made the commitment to bring this series of works into the collection of McMichael, where they will do so much heavy lifting in the collection. And Jobina took these objects. The process is interesting too, because she took these gowns and she buried them in her home territory for a period of time, and then took them out of the soil and beaded them, and then they're presented hanging. And the way that they're presented, of course, in a way, it's nice to see them after the Shubanites, because they move and they turn, and they're extremely delicate. The baptismal gowns themselves are very, very thin, and so they catch the every breeze, and that makes for a very startling and deeply moving experience to look at them. So we feel very blessed to have found these.
They're beautiful.
Really
They're almost, they would be disturbing if they weren't so beautiful.
Yeah.
And they are also very, as you say, very moving. And the fact that they're hanging there, and the one thing you can't see is what you just described, is the hanging at Art Toronto. They were just faintly moving, and I was just astonished by them. Really beautiful work.
It is beautiful work. So
Delighted to welcome them to McMichael.
And another artist that we're very close to at McMichael is Esma Mohammed, who's going to be showing with us sometime in the coming 18 months, 2 years. And we're just working that out. But these ebony and ivory are this is front and back view of works that are at the fair at Olga Corporate Gallery, but they're carved out of shea butter, which is used in cosmetics. And shea butter, Esma tells me, is a staple in cosmetic products that are made for black hair, but they're also increasingly used in products made for the settler market, more generally, the European world markets more generally. But the extraction of shea nuts in African countries, of course, has been, the usual colonial nightmare. And so, reclaiming the shea nut, and these do not, I would have thought shea butter would be more fluid and would be more susceptible to heat and so on, that it would be an unstable sculptural material. But apparently it's hard enough when it's rendered and packed that you can carve into it kind of almost like a wood. And so we are thinking right now about ways in which we might use shea butter in a sort of indoor-outdoor context at McMichael. But I think what we need to find out is whether or not mice like shea butter. But anyway, that will be part of our winter's research. But these are just beautiful, eloquent carvings that she has made. And each one of the works in this series is going to feature a different traditional hairstyle that run through a whole sort of repertoire. Of course, women's hair design being such an important signifier of identity and self-expression in Black culture. So I love these. So I just wanted to draw attention to those.
Could almost be 18th century French, I have to say.
Exactly. Well, I think that's precisely, the ambiguity in them. And I think that's, of course, France being a, major colonial power, very active in Africa. That's precisely the kind of echoes that she's going for there. The other acquisition that we made at the fair is June Clark's fantastic untitled sculpture from her series Perseverance. And again, this is one of the first objects in this series that she's made, but they're vessel sculptures that are made out of, there's a bowl at the heart of it, but then the other elements here are farm implements used in farming, working on the soil. And of course at McMichael, much of our collection has to do with landscape. And so We have, another work by Esma in our collection now as a promised gift that is one of her famous football player images with the kente cloth helmet and chains in the tobacco field. And, this extraordinary work by June Clark will have a great roommate there, and also will put the challenge to the settler paintings of landscape in our collection. But what I love about this work, if you just go back one, Jen, is that it's both, it's round, it's a vessel, it feels like it holds, it promises the offering of, food or water, or something is being held and offered, but it's also has this ferocious feeling of violence about it. So it's kind of both things somehow at the same time. And I think that's intriguing. And June was born in the United States, moved to Toronto and grew up here, and has made a huge contribution to art in Toronto, and both through her art making, through her teaching at the Ontario College of Art and Design, but made a signal series of works that were shown during COVID at Daniel Faria Gallery, in which she had revisited the American flag and kind of subjected it to a series of interventions, shall we say, that were quite dramatic, dismantling it, scoring it into threads, turning it into a pile, or venerating it in a little vitrine. And, that whole series is so brilliant. But she's looking at history always and positioning herself in relation to it. And I think this is a real masterwork to come into our
I
circle.
tell you what it reminds me of.
Mhm.
It reminds me of Henry Moore's helmet heads.
Yes.
There's a definite element of kind of Greek helmet about it, and I find
Mhm.
that fascinating too, because there's the
Mhm.
suggestion of the head in the shape of it,
Yes.
and that
Yeah.
the fork coming across the front.
Coming
It's
across like that.
it's like
Yeah.
armor.
It is.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it's a wonderful thing. So yes. And then this amazing piece by Michel Debrun. Now, I've been Quebec sculptor, one of the really dazzling creative spirits in Canada working today. And this is a small version. Bestiaire is actually a great big piece that has been installed in a park in Quebec. And it is an amalgam. Of course, it's sending up the tradition of the equestrian monument. But of course, it's headless and there's no rider, so things have gone badly awry. This dystopic, revisitation of the genre. But it's a mixture of both horses and, as far as I understand, and caribou and deer and all sorts of hooved creatures, all kind of co-joined together. But I mean, again, I guess we're going back to Dora Maar here, Ian, at the end. Tells you more about my feverish subconscious mind than perhaps you want to know. But I do love this piece, and I think it's a wonderful thing that we can see this small work in Toronto, because of course we'd have to travel to Quebec to see the other. I wish I could remember where that outdoor sculpture park is, where it's just been installed, but classic.
I never come across it at night.
Yeah, I mean, it's a classic piece of Canadian art, stepping up to the European tradition is what I love about it, throwing in a few caribou and deer in for good measure.
It's like one of these sort of nightmare car crash in the middle of the night up north.
Yes, it does. Beware Moose Crossing. Now we couldn't have a feast of Canadian art without pancakes. So this is and maple syrup. So forgive me. And Erica Ayers showing at Norberg Hall from Calgary, and she's apparently teaching at Glasgow School of Art, I'm given to understand. But I just thought, if we're having a feast of Canadian art, then we need to. There's one more detail here, Jen, for us, because we really love pancakes and maple syrup in this country, and. Time for a few Canadian cliches just to round things out. Last year we had Kablusiak's plucked oukpik, and this year it's pancakes. So brace yourself. We'll have to check it out next year and see what we have up our sleeve.
On that uplifting note, I'll hand over to Jen.
Well, we've come to the end of the best of the fair. But this represents only a tiny, tiny fraction of the wonders to behold at Art Toronto this year. So if you haven't been to the fair, I highly suggest that you make your way over there over the course of the weekend. It's open all day Saturday and Sunday. The McMichael has a booth at the fair. Naturally, we are BO2. So when you go up the escalator, immediately on the left, you'll see us, friendly faces, some news about what's coming up on our exhibition program. And we also have a table in the content section selling our publications. We have been hard at work during the pandemic closures and well, really over the last 3 years, creating high quality landmark publications from our historical shows and our contemporary shows. Some of them are in wide distribution, and a few are only available through the McMichael, whether on our eShop, on site at our museum, or at our table in the content section of the art fair. So do get yourselves down to check it out. Sarah and Ian, thank you so much for this window into your experience of the fair. Oh, go ahead, Sarah.
One thing to mention too is that I'll be speaking tomorrow at 2:00 on the platform at the fair with Corey Jackson from RBC. And RBC has been helping us out with our emerging artist residency in the Tom Thompson Shack. So we're going to be talking about that project that we did with Jen Aiken and other interventions that we've done over the last few years in which emerging artists or unexpected folks are being brought into dialogue with our core holdings at the McMichael, and I think it'll be a lot of fun. So maybe I can see some of you tomorrow at 2:00 at the fair.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm sorry to have almost missed that. Anyway, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Ian. And I enjoyed that so much. See you at the fair.
And then